Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Welcome, folks, back to another episode of Driving the Line podcast. This is Kenny Ray coming to you with my three dear friends and co-workers, Mike Bohan, Jim Seibert, and Barry Harrison. And we are going to discuss a topic today that is often ignored in our industry because it's a little bit of a blight on our industry. But it's one we need to discuss, and we need to have frank, open, transparent conversations about it. And it is the topic of cargo theft and the theft of commercial motor vehicles. We like to think that everybody in the trucking industry and everybody involved in trucking are good, upstanding, model citizens. But the reality is there's criminal activity that periodically finds its way into this industry that we love so very much. The FBI, which keeps national statistics on crime-related activity, notes that there are over 40,000 commercial motor vehicles stolen in our nation every year. 40,000. Let that sink in. That is 110 every day. That is 4 every hour. Meaning by the time we finish this podcast, 2 commercial motor vehicles will have been stolen in this country by the time we finish this podcast. And by the time we put up our microphones and our laptops and top off our coffee cup, 2 more will. And it's just around the clock, 110 a day are being stolen. And, all 4 of us are country boys, and we big financial numbers sometimes kind of boggle the mind, but it's a $35 billion loss to our industry. I can't even wrap my mind around that number, $35 billion, Mike. But that amount, and what that is, that's adding it all together, the cost of the trucks, the trailers, the cargo, insurance claims. It's just an absolute, like I said, a blight on our industry. And here in a little bit, I want us to talk about some solutions, some tips, some best practices that we can share with our listeners. But first, I want to set this up in any order you 3 guys want to do this, because each one of y'all have a unique background related to trucking. Mike, you probably have the strongest insurance background of any of us, having worked for a large major insurance carrier before you came to work for us. Barry, you've been both a driver and an operational manager and a safety manager, actually running a motor carrier. And Jim, with you being our ag guy and our OSHA guy, and I think of a unique perspective with you, because so many of our agricultural clients are also involved in hazardous material. They're providing chemicals to the farming and ranching communities wherever they're situated. And every one of us have driven through a rural part of our country and seen anhydrous ammonia nurse tanks sitting out in the middle of a field. Or we've driven by a farm co-op that's closed for the weekend and seen a tractor and a trailer rig parked there on the yard with placards on it, knowing that it's got hazmat on it. And those trucks are often in extremely rural areas. They're remote, which is a prime characteristic that thieves like, is to find something when nobody's watching them so they can take care of their activities. So, Mike, I'll start with you, with your background in the insurance industry and just knowing the catastrophic losses that occur from a financial standpoint and how that wreaks havoc on our industry.
Yeah, you talk about $35 billion a year. You're getting into amounts of money that it's really hard to comprehend. It's when we're looking at just the catastrophic effects that kind of money, that kind of dollar amount has against the trucking industry. It's something that, as you mentioned, if folks aren't thinking about it, they need to. And when I look at it, as far as from maybe not even necessarily an insurance perspective, but this is going to be wrapped up in it, a lot of this stuff revolves around the folks that you hire, the the locations that your trucks are going to be and what you're hauling. So it's like there's different aspects to it. And I think the biggest part of it is, and when I used to do loss control visits at the company I was at prior to coming over to MMA, that's something that we would continually ask, what do you haul any high value cargo? Where are you going? What routes are you taking? Those kind of things. But one of the biggest things we asked them was about the folks that they hire. What are your hiring standards? It's not just safety stuff. Do you do background checks? Are you checking up on these folks, or are you getting them in the truck just as quickly as you can because you've got a truck setting and you want to get it moving? Or are you doing due diligence to make sure that the folks that you're hiring, that they're going to be a good fit for your company? Because, as we had some kind of internal conversations prior to the podcast, there's a lot of this theft is internal. It's you hired your claim because
Yeah.
the person you hired came in and they ended up stealing your truck. They ended up stealing cargo. So that's something that companies need to think about is due diligence when they are qualifying a driver and recruiting driver, that whole process that you go through to make sure that you're getting good folks in the seats there. Another aspect that we would talk about is just the physical security. This could be at your terminal locations. If your truck's at a truck stop, it could be the physical security of the truck, things like that. What are you doing to make sure that the cargo, the truck, the trailer is secured when it's out there on the road? At your terminals, are they fenced, gated? Do you have guards, things like that? Those are all things that you can talk about as far as protecting your assets, protecting your truck, trailer, the cargo, limiting access to those areas and making sure that the drivers are aware of what they need to do when they're out there on the road. And that kind of comes into the operational piece of it as well. When they're en route, what those drivers can do when they're out there on the road. So there's layers to this as far as, how they can protect themselves as a company. We'll get into some of the tips here in a little bit, but I think those are some of the areas you have to look at is the folks you hire, where your trucks are going to be and how you can secure them and the load, and then what your policies and procedures are when that driver is en route, when they're actually on the road, maybe in truck stops, things like that. But it's all areas that I think you're right, Kenny. I think maybe get overlooked or maybe not looked at closely enough because again, when you're talking about if you're adding to that bill of $35 billion, it doesn't take much to eat into your profit margin, even just with one cargo claim, especially if it's not just the cargo they're stealing. If it's truck, trailer, and load, that's a claim that it's tough to bounce back from right away because it's you're not only losing the dollar amount for the truck, trailer, and load, but you're also losing a piece of equipment that's earning you money. So there's a lot of areas we need to look at there.
And you mentioned three things that I think would come to all of our minds, and they certainly need to be repeated. And again, we will before we even close here. And that's what kind of hiring practices they have. That is, who are they hiring? What kind of cargo do they haul? What kind of physical or facility security do they have, both at the yard and on their trucks? And I know, Barry, we were talking not long ago, and it's kind of a new phenomenon. I'm sure it's been going on for some, but it seems to be coming more to the forefront now. And that is the problem with these double brokering loads and brokers getting involved and somebody thinking a load's going to show up somewhere it never does, and it ends up somewhere else. And you've had some dealing with that.
Yes, definitely. And that was one of the things that really comes to mind for this. It's vetting those people that are you're deeming business partners, right? That's what we're trying to do here. We want to make sure that we're setting our company up for success and we're never putting a driver in a bad situation where they're delivering somewhere where someone's trying to steal that load. And the instance that comes to mind is the load was essentially double brokered. So what that means is the load is taken from one broker and then turned around and brokered to the carrier. And what had happened was during this double brokering process, the person who was essentially double brokering that load put an address to a warehouse that had been abandoned in essence and was open. and the delivery was actually made to that warehouse. And thank goodness the state that it happened in had become aware of the situation, and they responded very quickly. We were able to recover the cargo, but that's another element from an operational standpoint that we need to be very cognizant of. And we need to be making sure that once we know that delivery point, I challenge any dispatcher that may be on here listening, get on Google Maps and look at where you're going. If it looks like somewhere that may have been abandoned for a while, not well maintained, maybe we need to start asking some questions. Because again, looking at this from just a human perspective, we never want to send our driver somewhere where they may have to defend a load or anything like that. So again, I challenge anybody, get on there, get on Google Earth, get on whatever service you may be using, and just check that place out. Make sure that it's somewhere, call ahead, see if the phone works. Little things like that can really, just add that process or procedure in and make sure that you can make a safe delivery to where the cargo needs to go.
And you bring up an element when you were telling that story, and we were aware that you had dealt with that in the past, but we normally think of cargo theft or even theft of the commercial motor vehicle itself as a property crime, that, we've lost our stuff, we have a financial loss. But you mentioned in this story, on these loads now that are intentionally getting redirected to a place where they were not originally intended to go. So what's happening is the driver picks up a load, and instead of going to a legitimate customer to deliver that load, that driver is directed through this double brokering process to deliver that load to a different site, where the entire intent of that process is to make that load available to be stolen. And you brought up an interesting point, that driver may be caught right in the middle of that, not being complicit in it, but as a victim. He or she may get to that location and figure out, I'm fixing to get robbed. They're fixing to take my truck and my trailer and this load. And that actually puts that driver in physical danger of harm to his own or herself. I mean, these kind of deals can end up being really bad, going from a property crime to a violent crime in a matter of a few minutes. And so it's really something important for us to think about. And again, when we share some tips for preventing this in a minute, I want you to certainly share again the things that y'all did to keep that safe. But Jim, I want to bring you in for a second. You and I both have a hazmat background, you dealing with hazmat through OSHA and ag, and me in the transportation industry. And after 9/11 occurred, the Department of Homeland Security started getting right in the middle of hazmat transportation. And we now, part of our training for our hazmat motor carriers, they must do security training. And if they're operating under an FMCSA hazmat safety permit, they must do in-depth security training. They must have a transportation security plan and train on that. And one of the areas that often gets overlooked is our ag sector. And there's a lot of carve outs in federal law for the agricultural industry, and I'm not taking a position either way on that. That it's just the reality. There are a lot of things that the ag world gets exempt from some of the federal regs. But the reality is, we see in the rural parts of our country often we will see unattended hazardous material vehicles, whether that's a commercial motor vehicle that can both be on the highway and possibly off-road as well. And then certainly with these anhydrous ammonia nurse tanks that we see all over the country that basically they're carrying an inhalation hazard poison, a poisonous gas. So what are, from this idea about theft and the theft of cargo and the way that can impact the ag industry, particularly with the truck part of the ag industry, the transportation part of the ag industry. Jim, how do you see this applying to them?
So where the DOT may lack or not lack, but provide a little bit of grace and room for maneuvering for the ag industry, the EPA sure does step up in many states. And so I just spent a solid time last week working on a risk management plan for a customer in Northwest Missouri. And when they talk about security, it's not just about environmental release, but they talk about physical security. And Kenny, you're right. There's nurse tanks, there's anhydrous ammonia bullets all over the countryside, whether they are at the physical address of where the headquarters is. That's not always the case. A lot of times they've got bullets, large reservoirs of anhydrous ammonia stationed all over the country in satellite locations. And those could be seasonal locations to where, okay, we get filled up. Well, it may sit there for a month prior to us having an employee there and having the farmers come in and pick it up. So where the EPA comes in is you have to stand up a physical security. And when I think of physical security, I think about the rings of security. You've got an internal ring. Well, that internal ring is typically, what are we doing to protect? It's a cybersecurity, for lack of a better term for it. What are we doing to protect our data, our computer systems, our electronics, whatever it is at the location? That's the inner ring. Then we move to the outer ring. How are we locking valves? How are we ensuring that people cannot come in and take the product? What's the design? What's the makeup of the tanks and the storage structures? That's the middle ring. The outer ring is what physical barrier can we stop? And you can tie in chain link fence, concertina wire, barbed wire across the top of these tanks. You can have electronic codes. You can have sensors that, hey, when the fence breaks, it notifies 4 or 5 other cell phones. So when I think of security of those assets in a physical, static location, that's what I think of. And some companies do it well, others do not. But what happens when the product is picked up by our employees and moved out and set in fields all up and down the highways, all up and down the country roads, all over the place? You can still have geolocation. You can still have locks. You can still have codes. Well, locks only keep honest people honest, but when we think about slowing down the steel, locks can be a slowdown. Those geolocation devices, those can help track where it got picked up and when it got picked up. And my particular customer inside in Northwest Missouri, hey, their standard operating procedure that I helped them start up was a tank is left. They're either delivering only to the farm site, the location of where the farmer lives or their farm site, and it's there and somebody signs for it and picks it up, or it is in a pre-selected spot that's not visible from the road. So how do we hide the tank, and how do we ensure that the producer has taken possession of the tank prior to us just leaving it and saying, okay, it's under you and your insurance now until we come back and get it. So Kenny, that's what I think of when I talk about those hazardous materials. And it's not just anhydrous ammonia. It could be many other ag aspects that are high dollar, that pesticides that fully line up there as well. So it's rings of security, and it's a handoff of the ownership of the product, not just always leaving it in a location. That's when it's susceptible to being stolen.
You know, those things you just mentioned are not unique to the hazmat and the ag world. The principles you described are applicable across our industry. And like Barry brought up about the danger that's involved physically to a truck driver on these diverted loads that are being diverted to a place other than where they were supposed to go. When you brought up about those rings of security, and you mentioned that inner one being cybersecurity, one of the ways that these diverted loads are taking place there are shipping documents that are being manipulated at the computer level. And so that cybersecurity stuff even comes into play on cargo theft and vehicle theft, because our systems, our dispatch systems, our delivery systems, our customer systems are so interconnected now that if somebody can access the ability to determine where that truck goes through a simple computer command, then imagine the devastation they could cause just by diverting a truck. And the truck driver just simply gets dispatch notes. He or she's told, here, you go to this location and deliver. And they don't know if it's a legitimate location or not. And so that cybersecurity even comes into play on this entire topic about commercial motor vehicle theft and cargo theft. Guys, I want to open it up and just y'all have already shared some tips in your descriptions of the particular your thoughts about this overall topic, but I just want to open it up for some best practices. And let me repeat a few of the things y'all have already mentioned. Mike talked about vigorous background checks, not just a cursory check. If you ever study criminology and there's an entire branch of study in the criminal justice system called recidivism. And recidivism is the propensity or the likelihood that somebody will recommit a criminal act that they've committed in the past. Well, theft is one of the highest for recidivism. So if you hire somebody that has had a problem with theft in the past, do not be surprised when they steal your truck or your trailer or your load. So vigorous background investigation is important. We've talked about secure facilities. I don't know how many trucking companies I drive by on a daily basis. Not very many of our clients, but a lot of trucking companies that have no gate, no fence, and a lot of them, particularly if they slip seat trucks where they have two drivers driving the same truck, they leave the keys in the tractor. You can just walk out there and the door's unlocked and you open the door and the key is there in the ignition switch. And it's a completely unsecured facility. So the physical securement of the facility, limiting access to shipping information. That's where we're talking about these diverted loads and this, the cybersecurity. And we mentioned hazmat. One thing about hazmat drivers are taught to have a no-stop policy. If you load and leave and somebody's trying to get you to pull over on the side of the highway, you don't stop just because somebody's trying to get you to motion over. They certainly could have ill intents and be after that hazmat load to use for various nefarious reasons. And a lot of companies adopt a policy that particularly ones that haul high value cargo, we're talking about electronics, computers, TVs, things like that. If they load, they have a policy that their driver's not allowed to stop for the first 200 or 250 miles to keep them, get them out away from where they loaded. So if there's local criminals watching that loading facility, that truck driver won't leave, go 2 blocks down the road to a truck stop and go in and get a soft drink or a cup of coffee and afford those people the opportunity to cut a lock and take computers or TVs out of the back. One of the most innovative things, and I haven't heard of very many companies that do this, but I know of one that does. They have an internal Crime Stoppers program within their company. And depending on the seriousness of what somebody reports, if somebody reports a minor thing and it fleshes out to be legitimate, that person may receive $50 or $100. They report something serious, somebody's misusing their fuel card and they're stealing fuel, or somebody's stealing tires from the shop, and somebody reports that, and it ends up being accurate information. They'll pay up to $500, even $1,000, and they basically, even though a lot of people would say, well, you're compelling your drivers to snitch on each other. What that does, though, it keeps the dishonest people from wanting to be a part of that operation. So. And one thing I did want to mention, Mike mentioned, where do we run to? And this is no slight to these locales at all, because it's going to be a blight on my state as well. But there are certain parts of the country that have higher rates of commercial motor vehicle thefts and cargo thefts. Southern California is one. The state of Florida is one. The state of Texas is one. And then the one municipal area that's most noted is the greater Atlanta, Georgia area. So the point is, if you run those areas, you need to be hyper vigilant about trying to protect your trucks and your trailers and your cargo and the safety of your drivers. So guys, in addition to those things, any other best practices that y'all have heard of that works well, or y'all been familiar with personally?
One of the things that you were just talking about there, Kenny, was the no stop policies and getting out that 200, 250 miles for drivers, so they're not stopping in case somebody was casing it. It's also important for those drivers, even if they're beyond that 250, they're out there on the road. If they're hauling, it doesn't even have to be high value cargo. We're just talking about protecting themselves and their truck, trailer, and their load. But especially with high value cargo, don't talk about that stuff when you're out on the road. You're in the truck stop, somebody, wants to have a conversation with you. Hey, where you headed? What are you hauling? That kind of stuff. That's, play your cards close to your chest there. You don't have to share all the information you have about what you got going on, because a lot of times that will happen. Thieves can target somebody that way. They can figure out, what they're hauling, case that truck, and either steal the truck in the trailer, or they're taking the cargo. So that's, that entire trip. When you're having those conversations, be general. It's like, I'm not telling you never to have a conversation with somebody, but your load is your business, and you need to protect that. And one of the other things that you guys have discussed a little bit is just the technology aspect of this, and something that's interesting. We have opportunistic thieves that are going to steal things, and then we've got very sophisticated kind of networks of folks that are going to try to steal your equipment, your cargo. But this idea of the technology that we use, there's a lot of folks that use GPS tracking on trucks, trailers, things like that. Well, the sophisticated thieves are very good at finding that equipment and disabling it. I've had a lot of companies that it's like, well, we had GPS tracking on the trailer, and it took them, 2 minutes to find it, disable it, and take it off, and it's laying in the parking lot, and the trailer's 500 miles away, and we have no idea. I mean,
Right.
it literally happens every day. So they've gotten more creative on hiding that technology. I'm not saying the technology is bad. I'm just saying that the folks that are unfortunately making a career out of stealing other people's stuff are pretty sophisticated in what they do. Jim, you were talking about locks on the trailers. That keeps the honest folks honest. That's not much, but I would tell the simple things, whether it's you're using the technology to help track trailers, things like that, or the simple things of a driver just putting a lock on a trailer door. Do everything you can to secure that. And I think that is important. But one of the big things for me is, regardless of what a company does to secure their cargo and truly to keep their drivers safe out on the road, when it comes to, somebody trying to take their load, is make this a part of your training program. Make your drivers aware, this is how we're going to keep you safe. This is how we're going to protect our cargo, and certainly protect you guys when you're out on the road. When they're out on the road, talk to them about where they stop. If you pull into a place and you stop and think, I'm going to stop here because there's no other trucks around, it's not busy. Well, it might be there's no other trucks around for a reason. That might not be the safest place to stop. You know what I'm
That's
saying?
right.
It's you hate to pull into a busy truck stop because it's hard to find a place to park and all this, but a lot of times thieves don't like an audience when they're doing their deed of stealing somebody's stuff. So sometimes those are safer areas when you're around the crowd. So think about that when you're stopping. I know in these metro areas that we work in, and we're all in rural areas where we live, but we all work in metro areas with our clients, things like that. There's places in those areas that you don't want to stop for a break, let alone stop for an overnight stay. So, and I know there's times when we have to, based on the hours we may have available, things like that. But that comes down into that training, load planning, trip planning, things like that, where we look at, we're going to pick up this load here in this particular area. We want to make sure that our driver has enough hours that he can get away from this area and find a good place to rest and get his hours reset. But that's something that the driver and the company, the operations folks, they need to work together on. And that's one other thing that I would say when the drivers are out on the road is, Kenny, you were talking like drivers are getting their dispatch orders, and off they go. But there needs to be some good communication between the office and the drivers, some regular communication, so everybody knows what's going on with the load, especially with those high value loads, because ultimately we're just dealt this hand. I mean, there's people after, and I hate to make it sound like a horror story, but there's people after your truck, your trailer, and your load every day. Kenny, you mentioned
Absolutely.
it at the beginning of the podcast. In the time we've been talking, two of them been stolen already
That's right.
since we started.
Absolutely. Yes.
So it's just what we've been dealt here. So we've got to be intentional in our decisions and look at this in any other way we would try to manage our risk, and set our companies and our drivers up for success. Like I said, make this a part of your onboarding orientation training. Set your drivers down. Say, okay, here's what we expect when you're out on the road. Here's what our terminal securities are like. Here's what we would like, the types of places we'd like you to park. That's all going to set them up for success and keep them safer out there on the road.
Absolutely.
That training that Mike spoke of, I wanted to share one more quick story with you guys that kind of goes back to the nonstop policy, right? I mean, that's regulatory. We cannot stop. And one of the hard situations I ran into when I was hauling fuel was I was headed up I-35 and I came up on an accident. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and there's a truck or a four-wheeler truck that had hit a guardrail. And it's obvious, that the wreck was legitimate. And I'll tell you guys, it was tough for me not to stop. And there was another car there that was helping that person out. But, when you talk about that training, you go into that why. Why are we training not to stop, right? Because again, we're trying to preserve human life. We're trying not to put that driver in the situation where if you do pull over and it's not a legitimate accident and the person's trying to take your truck and trailer and that cargo, you're in a bad situation there. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of training up, making sure that you've got the right policy in place, and making sure that person knows that, yeah, we're worried about the cargo, but even more so, we're worried about you being in any kind of compromising situation where you may feel like you have to defend yourself. So again, it goes back to, it may go against every inch of your being and fiber, but brother, that is a very compromising situation that can be dangerous. So that's why we don't stop. We don't want you to be in any kind of situation where you feel like you may have to defend your load or yourself. So
yep,
it's very important to push that home.
You bet.
Mike, you talked extensively about background checks, and Kenny, then you brought in criminology, and we know your history, and my sister is in law enforcement. She's currently I refuse to call her Your Honor, but she's currently a judge. But this could be a bridge too far, and I might be throwing a curveball. So prepare yourselves, gents. But I have a very, very close dear friend that had owned a trucking company for years. Just started from nothing with a one log hauling truck in southeast Oklahoma, and built it into something amazing. And he's since retired. We were at the lake together a few weeks ago, and I like to pick his brain and learn as much about real trucking as I can. And he said something to me that I thought was pretty profound. And it's that it's cheaper to park a truck or a rig than it is to make a bad hire. You guys talked about background checks. Can we weave something together here? Kenny, what in this background check and in our onboarding process, what red flags would stick out to you guys? We talked about it being there's a lot that's an internal job that's done here. Is there any correlation? Is there what can we tell our listeners to look out for in the mindset of, hey, I've got less chance of a loss just by sitting this rig than I do if I make a bad hire here?
Yeah, and a lot of motor carriers run a criminal history check as part of their background. A lot don't, and because they normally have to pay for that service. And I just I think that if you went to any owner or CEO of a trucking company that had an internal theft that was committed by somebody that they could have discovered that through a background check, I think they would have told you then in retrospect, we should have checked that, and we didn't.
Should have paid for it.
Because there's so many things. I mean, for those of us in the industry, if you take a brand new tractor, a nice tractor, and a trailer and a cargo of any decent value, you're talking about $500,000 very, very quickly. $500,000 loss that could have been prevented. And so, how much does it cost to run that criminal history versus losing $500,000? And in my mind, there's no comparison there. So I wish more of our clients did do well. Most of our clients do. I wish more people in the industry did that.
Yeah. One of the other things that I see, and I think it's going that extra step, running that full background check. You're looking at their history there, but there's things sometimes I see where, there's just doing due diligence on the things that the DOT requires when you're looking at a 10-year history on their employment application and there's big gaps. Dig into that. If there's gaps in employment, you got to dig into those areas and figure out, why was there a 2-year gap here? Why was there a 5-year, whatever. Ask those questions, because I've seen that happen, where the reason why there was a gap there is because that guy was not walking among us. He was behind bars somewhere. I mean, it's unfortunately that's what happens. And I don't want to make light of it, but what I'm telling the safety directors out there is, if you or your staff are checking doing the checks, just the DOT regulated checks, checking with previous employers, if you see gaps there, you got to dig into that. You got to ask the questions and figure out as much as you can there.
Amen, brother. Well, folks, we're going to wrap up this episode, and we hope, if nothing else, we've brought to the forefront of your awareness the fact that this commercial motor vehicle theft and cargo theft is an issue. And as we mentioned at the top of the recording, 2 vehicles have been stolen during the time we've been talking. And so the 4 of us, we're fixing to close down our laptops. We're going to put up our microphones. We're going to top off our coffee, and then we'll go on about our day. And while we're doing that, 2 more will have been stolen. And we just don't want it to be one of yours. So harden those targets, train your drivers, do your due diligence, and make sure you're not part of those statistics that the FBI accumulates every single year. So until next time, for the Driving the Line crew, thank you for joining us. Y'all be safe, keep your drivers safe, and we'll talk to you next time.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.